Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I've lived in Red Hollow, Texas as long as I can remember. It's a quiet place that most people overlook. I'm not one for excitement, which is probably why I ended up as the cemetery groundskeeper. My dad worked the job before me, and his dad before him. It's an old family tradition, I suppose, though it's not exactly a job you'd call glamorous. There's not much to do at the cemetery, just trimming the grass, maintaining the paths, fixing up broken fences, and occasionally planting new flowers around the graves. It's a peaceful job, mostly. The cemetery sits on the edge of town down a winding dirt road that seems to stretch forever, lined with rows of scraggly oaks that make the place feel even more isolated. If you were to stand in the middle of it on a quiet evening, you'd think the whole world had forgotten about this spot. The gravestones are old, some of them so worn and cracked you can't make out the names anymore. Others are more recent, their marble surfaces still smooth and white. The cemetery doesn't really get many visitors, except for the occasional mourner or curious tourist, so most of the time I've got the place to myself. It was one of those muggy summer nights. I'd been working late trying to finish up some repairs on the old maintenance shed, just fixing a few loose boards and checking the locks. It was dark when I got the shed doors closed and was about to leave, but then I heard it, a faint sound like something tapping against stone. It was soft at first, almost like wind whistling through the trees, but then it came again, a little louder. I paused, listening. It didn't sound like a natural noise. No, this was something deliberate. A rhythmic clink, like metal striking stone or rock. My first thought was that it was some kids messing around, maybe looking for a place to hang out, or maybe trying to pull some kind of prank. The cemetery wasn't exactly a hotspot for trouble, but there were always a few rowdy teenagers who thought it'd be fun to sneak in after dark. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a few cautious steps toward the back of the cemetery where the older graves were. The clink was louder now, more distinct. I had to be sure before I called the sheriff, so I walked quietly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of damp earth hung heavy around me. The only light came from the moon, which hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of graves. As I walked, I had to duck under low branches of oak trees, the rough bark scraping against my arms. The crickets were louder now. The path was narrow, winding around older headstones. Then I saw him, a shadow, hunched low against a freshly dug grave, a figure working with a shovel. The man's back was to me, his body silhouetted by the dim light of the moon. I froze, my stomach tightening. Someone was digging, their movements frenzied and jerky, as if they were in a hurry. His shovel struck the earth with a loud clink, and each time it did, I could feel my pulse quicken. For a moment, I just stood there, watching, unsure of what to do. Was he a grave robber? A vandal? What on earth was he doing in the cemetery at this hour, digging up a grave? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I could feel a cold knot in my chest, a creeping dread that I couldn't shake. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I didn't want to alert the man to my presence just yet. Instead, I crouched down behind a large mausoleum, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to steady my breath, but the closer I got to the scene, the harder it was to keep quiet. My boots crunched softly against the gravel as I moved, but the man didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on the grave, his shovel striking the earth over and over again. I took another step closer, trying to get a better look. The man was thin, his clothes ragged and dirty, like he hadn't seen a wash in weeks. His hands were rough and calloused, and his fingers trembled as he gripped the shovel. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out his movements clearly. And then I accidentally stepped on a twig, causing it to make a faint crunching sound. Suddenly, the man stopped. His shovel froze midair, and for a moment, everything was silent. I barely dared to breathe. I could see him looking around, his head jerking up as though he had sensed something. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not daring to move. And then, without warning, the man whipped around, just his wild eyes locking onto mine in an instant. His face was pale, caked in dirt, his eyes wide and feverish, like a man who hadn't slept in days. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me. But then, before I could even react, he dropped the shovel and lunged toward me. I don't know what drove me to move so fast, but I spun around and ran. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could hear his heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer. I scrambled for the maintenance shed, nearly tripping over my own feet in my panic. My hands shook as I fumbled with the key, struggling to unlock the door. Finally, I shoved it open and slammed it behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I rushed to lock the door, my hands shaking so badly I almost missed the keyhole. The pounding on the door came moments later, hard, violent bangs, each one rattling the shed. I jumped back, my heart in my throat. He was outside, trying to get in. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Finally, I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff. "Hello?" His voice was groggy, like I'd woken him up. "Sheriff, it's Eddie. There's someone in the cemetery. He's digging up a grave. He tried to attack me." My words came out rushed, panicked. "Stay put, Eddie. We're on our way." I pressed the phone to my ear, my heart racing as the pounding on the door continued. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. Silence fell over the shed, thick and heavy. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the only sound now was the beat of my own heart. When the sheriff and a couple of deputies arrived, it didn't take long to find the man. He was still by the grave, his hands dirty and shaking as he dug with that same frantic urgency. They pulled him away with force, his body slamming to the ground as they restrained him. It was only when they dragged him up to the squad car that I got a better look at him. The deputies had trouble getting him into the car, but he didn't fight back as much as I thought he might. It was the sheriff who finally spoke to me, his voice low. "You all right, Eddie?" I nodded, still shaken, still trying to process everything. I didn't really know what had happened, only that it felt like I had stumbled into something far worse than I had imagined. Under questioning, the man, who introduced himself as Carl, told the sheriff that he had been traveling from cemetery to cemetery, searching for graves he believed held valuable items. According to him, there were legends, local rumors, that some families buried their wealth with their dead. Gold, jewelry, priceless heirlooms. And he had been digging up graves, one after the other, hoping to find his fortune. Carl was arrested and taken away. The sheriff told me they'd keep an eye on the cemetery from now on, but I didn't feel much comfort in that. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the cemetery. Months have passed, and I've kept my distance. Yet every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that something is still buried there, waiting. It was early summer when I moved to that house. My name's Alex Miller, and I was ready for a fresh start. A small town in Texas, far from the chaos of city life, seemed like the perfect place to unwind. The house I'd bought was modest, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a backyard that stretched far enough to keep a good distance from the neighbors. The kind of house that would have been considered cozy in a different life, but after living in cramped apartments for years, it felt like a mansion. But there was one thing about the house that kept me awake at night. The graveyard. Willow Rest Cemetery, it was called. And honestly, from the first moment I laid eyes on it, I didn't like it. It was on the edge of town, about 100 yards from my backyard, hidden behind a rusted, sagging fence. At a glance, it seemed like any other old cemetery. Rows upon rows of weathered headstones, some leaning crookedly, others buried under the weight of moss and time. It seemed peaceful during the day. I never saw anyone visiting, never heard the sounds of mourning or prayer. In fact, the only time I ever saw anyone even come close was a woman who would walk by on her way to the grocery store. One evening, about a week after I'd settled in, I was bored. I hadn't made any friends in the area yet and hadn't started work, so I was looking for something to do. I'd recently bought a drone, a small one, nothing too fancy, but it had a camera, and I thought I'd take it out for a spin, maybe get some cool shots of the sunset over the fields behind my house. There was a nice breeze that evening, and the sky was filled with hues of orange and pink as the sun began to dip low. The graveyard seemed to catch the light in a strange way. Long shadows, the sun setting right behind it, casting a beautiful yet eerie glow across the old stone markers. I set up the drone in the backyard, getting the controls familiar in my hands, feeling the quiet hum of excitement. I'd never flown one before, but it seemed simple enough. I pressed the throttle, and the drone whirred into the air, hovering over the field. I was just starting to get the hang of it, flying it smoothly over the tall grass, when a sudden gust of wind picked up. The drone jerked sideways, spinning out of control in mid-air. I yanked the joystick back, trying to regain control, but the thing wouldn't listen. It swerved hard to the left, darting out of my control zone, and then, wham! It crashed into the ground with a sickening thud, disappearing into the overgrowth just beyond the fence. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where it fell. Damn, that wasn't going to be easy to find, and I didn't want to leave it out there overnight. It wasn't just some cheap toy, it had cost me a decent amount of money. So I made up my mind. I was going after it. The sun had set by then, and the sky had turned dark, the first stars twinkling through the fading orange glow. I grabbed my flashlight, a cheap thing from the hardware store that barely lit up a few feet in front of me. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I made my way to the fence. I climbed through a loose section in the fence, my hands scraping against the rough edges of the wood as I squeezed through. The cemetery stretched out before me, cold and silent. I could see the headstones now, most of them covered in creeping vines or leaning at odd angles. I took a few hesitant steps deeper into the graveyard, my flashlight beam jittering with each movement. I could feel the chill of the air seeping into my skin as I walked further. That's when I saw it, something that made me stop for a moment. At the far edge of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a row of old headstones, was a tent. It wasn't new, not by any means. The fabric was tattered and faded, the pole bent in odd directions. A tent in the middle of a graveyard, of all places. I crept closer, my heartbeat quickening as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I stepped forward, reaching out with my hand, when suddenly, a rustle behind me, I spun around, my breath catching in my chest. A figure, tall, ragged, and disheveled, lurched out of the darkness. I barely had time to react before the man was on me. He was wild-eyed, his hair matted to his scalp, clothes torn and filthy. He lunged at me, his breath reeked of stale sweat. He knocked me to the ground, and the flashlight slipped from my hand, skittering across the dirt. "Who sent you?" he hissed, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. His eyes were frantic, pupils blown wide. "Why are you here? Why are you watching me?" I could barely process what was happening. My mind was racing as I tried to catch my breath, my arms pinned beneath him. I'm not here to hurt you," I stammered, trying to push him off. "I lost my drone. I just want to find it and leave." But the man wasn't listening. His hands were digging into my shoulders, his nails scratching at my skin, and then I saw it. A rusted, jagged knife glinting in the moonlight. He was holding it tightly and he brought it closer to my side. Fear surged through me, cold and sharp. This wasn't just some random encounter. Something was wrong, and I had to get away. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked my legs free, shoving him off of me with every ounce of strength I could muster. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted through the graveyard, my feet crashing against the uneven ground. The man was behind me. I pushed myself harder, faster as I reached the broken fence, the air in my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't dare look back. My hands were trembling as I scrambled through the gap in the fence, barely squeezing through in time. I was out, back in the safety of my yard, and I slammed the door behind me, locking it quickly. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone and called the police, my voice barely more than a whisper. The officers arrived shortly after, and I led them to the cemetery. My body was still rattled with adrenaline, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. They didn't say much while we walked through the graveyard, their flashlights slicing through the dark. The air was heavy with that same oppressive silence I'd felt earlier. The officers moved methodically, checking the area, moving between the headstones and the broken mausoleum in the back. It wasn't long before they found something, old food wrappers, a tattered sleeping bag stuffed in the corner near a collapsed stone. And there, tangled in the weeds, was my drone, its plastic shell cracked, the camera lens shattered. They didn't find him immediately, but after a couple of hours of searching, one of the officers called out from near the drainage ditch that ran alongside the cemetery. They'd found him. Hiding, of course. The man was dragged out of the culvert, his eyes wild and vacant, as though he hadn't seen another human in months. Turns out the man wasn't just some drifter. He was a fugitive, wanted for assault in a neighboring county. He'd been living in the graveyard for weeks, hiding out in plain sight, using the cemetery as his personal shelter. The police told me I was lucky. If I hadn't gotten away when I did, things could have been much worse. I never went back to Willow Rest Cemetery after that night. And even now, when I look out the back window of my house and catch a glimpse of the dark silhouette of the graveyard against the horizon, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, something waiting, and I don't want to know what it is. It was late. Really late. I had just left my buddy's ranch out on the outskirts of town, and I was making my way home to the city. It was the kind of drive that's peaceful in some ways. Just you, the road, and the occasional flicker of headlights cutting through the dark. I remember thinking that I wasn't going to make it back until after midnight, maybe even 1 a.m. The only sounds were the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the distant chirping of crickets. My car, an old beat-up sedan, had always been a little finicky, but tonight it was worse than usual. Out of nowhere, the engine started sputtering, and before I knew it, the damn thing just died on me. No warning. Just a few sputters and then silence. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. Not even the whir of the engine trying to turn over. I threw my hands up in frustration. Great. Just great. I glanced at the dashboard, but there wasn't much to see. No lights flashing, no indicators telling me what had gone wrong. The gas tank was full, so I knew it wasn't that. But there I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone signal and my battery rapidly draining. I'd heard rumors of a cemetery nearby. Hollow Oak Cemetery, I think it was called. It wasn't far, about a mile off the main road. The gates were barely visible from the highway, covered with rust and twisted iron vines. I thought if I could get to the cemetery, I could cut through it and hopefully find my way to the main road. Maybe I'd even get some signal out there, someplace with a little more traffic. I grabbed my flashlight and my keys and locked the car behind me. The night air felt heavy, almost oppressive. but I figured I'd be fine as long as I kept moving. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I walked. The road leading to the cemetery was narrow and overgrown, the kind of path you'd expect to see in a horror movie. Tall, wild grass on either side, swaying in the breeze, and the distant sound of leaves rustling. The cemetery itself wasn't much better. When I got to the rusted gates, they groaned like they hadn't been opened in years. The fog was thick, rolling in low, curling up around the gravestones, making everything feel more surreal. There were only a few street lamps scattered near the entrance. I stepped through the gates. I hadn't realized just how old the place was. Tombstones tilted at odd angles, some cracked, some half buried. It was as though the cemetery had been abandoned for decades. The air smelled musty, and the fog kept rolling in, blocking out the few stars that managed to shine through the haze. I figured I'd walk straight through and get out the other side. The path was narrow, winding between headstones that seemed to lean in on me as I passed. I felt a little uncomfortable, but nothing major. It was just a cemetery, right? That's when I first heard it. Footsteps. Soft, but unmistakable. The gravel shifting beneath someone else's feet. I stopped dead in my tracks. My flashlight beam caught the shadows of the tombstones around me, but I didn't see anyone. I thought maybe I was just hearing things. Maybe the wind had shifted the branches of nearby trees. It was quiet again, the silence hanging thick. I took a few more steps, but then there it was again. The footsteps. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a trick of the wind. Someone was behind me, walking, no, following me. I didn't dare turn around. I thought about just walking faster, but I didn't want to look obvious, didn't want whoever it was to know that I'd noticed them. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept walking, pretending like everything was fine. Maybe it was just someone else walking through the cemetery, right? I tried to convince myself that it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but the footsteps kept matching my pace. Every time I slowed down, they slowed. Every time I quickened my step, they did too. At that point, my stomach dropped. I stopped walking entirely. I stood still for a second, trying to hear anything beyond the sound of my own heartbeat. They kept going, closer, louder. Whoever or whatever was behind me was getting closer. I spun around, shining my flashlight in a wide arc, but there was nothing there. Just the tombstones, the fog rolling in thicker now. No sign of anyone. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, just beyond the beam of my light. A shadow. It moved quickly between the gravestones, too fast for me to catch with my flashlight. My heart was pounding. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I took off running. My feet hit the ground harder, faster now. I weaved through the graves, dodging cracked stones and uneven patches of dirt. I was sprinting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind me, the sound of footsteps following my every move, closer, faster. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The fog was thickening, but for a split second, I saw something. A figure, barefoot, moving in a jerky, unnatural way like it couldn't control its movements. The figure ducked behind a gravestone just as I looked back. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of there. I could barely make out the shape of the broken side fence ahead. The headlights of a car flashed through the fog as I reached the fence, and I pushed myself harder. I reached the road. My feet were numb, my breath ragged, but there was the truck, its headlights blinding in the dark. The driver, an older man, looked at me like I was some kind of ghost when I practically slammed my hands on the truck's hood. His eyes were wide with surprise. I could barely get the words out. "Help me," I gasped. "There's someone in there, someone following me." He didn't hesitate. He unlocked the door and told me to get in fast. I didn't need to be told twice. I glanced back at the cemetery, but all I saw were the gates slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror. It took me a long time to calm down enough to speak. The man behind the wheel just kept glancing over at me, his hands gripping the wheel tight. He wasn't saying much. Finally, I found my voice. "What the hell was that?" I asked, trying to steady my breath. "Who was that back there?" The old man just shook his head slowly, his face grim. "I don't know," he said, "but there's something strange about that place. I know you're scared. I would be too. But don't go back there." When we finally got to the nearest gas station, I thanked him and bolted out of the truck. My body was shaking, and I just wanted to get as far away from that cemetery as possible. I tried calling the police once I calmed down, but the guy at the station said they were already on their way. I explained everything as best as I could. The next morning, the police found the guy, the one who had been following me. They'd searched the cemetery and found him hiding between the gravestones, holding a broken piece of stone like it was some kind of weapon. Turns out he had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility a few nights before. He was known for violent behavior, and they'd been looking for him. The officers said he'd probably been living off the land, hiding in the cemetery, stealing food and supplies from nearby homes. I don't know what would have happened if that truck hadn't passed by when it did. I still don't drive those back roads anymore, not since that night. And at every time I pass a graveyard, even in the daylight, I get that icy shiver running down my spine. I never thought a simple favor would end up being one of the scariest things to ever happen to me. I was staying at my neighbor's house in a small, quiet suburb in Texas while she was away for the weekend. Her name is Mrs. Dalton, an older woman who'd been living on our street for as long as I can remember. When she asked me to watch her dog Milo, I didn't hesitate. I'd always liked that dog, big, goofy, and gentle as they come. He was an old Labrador mix, and the thought of keeping him company for a couple of days seemed like an easy enough task. Now, Mrs. Dalton's house backs up to an old graveyard trail. I'm sure most of you are familiar with those types of places, the kind that's technically public land, but people generally avoid at night because, well, it just feels off. The cemetery was one of those places that no one really talked about, but everyone knew about. I'd heard plenty of local stories over the years, but most of them were about ghostly whispers and the usual creepy stuff. Nothing that I took too seriously. I never gave it much thought until that night. The house felt eerily quiet after Mrs. Dalton left. Milo, who had been moping around, was restless too. He was pacing the living room, looking at me like he wanted something more than just a bowl of food. By the time the sun had set, I was starting to feel a little bored. The silence in the house was oppressive, so I clipped the leash onto Milo, grabbed my jacket, and decided to take him for a walk to stretch our legs. The night was clear, with just a sliver of moonlight hanging low in the sky. The shadows in the backyard stretched long, and the cemetery behind the house looked almost serene, though I couldn't shake off the unease I always felt when looking at it. It wasn't a grand cemetery with towering, ornate headstones. No, this one was old. The stones were crooked and weathered, some so tilted they looked like they were about to fall over. The paths were cracked and uneven, winding between old mausoleums, forgotten graves, and patches of overgrown grass. The whole place seemed to hum with something that didn't quite belong in the world of the living. I tried to brush off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. After all, it was just a walk in the park, or in this case, the trail behind the cemetery. Milo was trotting ahead of me, sniffing around, his tail wagging, completely oblivious to the dark vibes that seemed to surround the graveyard. As we walked deeper into the trail, the trees lining the path created long, twisting shadows that made it harder to see where we were going. I heard the faint rustling of leaves underfoot and the occasional distant croak of a frog. There were no other sounds, though. Then Milo stopped. I didn't think much of it at first. Dogs stop and sniff all the time. But he didn't just stop. He froze, his body tense. It was like he sensed something I couldn't. His nose twitched, and then he looked back at me, letting out a low growl. That sound, deep, almost guttural, came from a place I'd never heard before in him. Milo wasn't an aggressive dog. He was more of a lover than a fighter, and I could tell this was something out of the ordinary. "Milo? What is it, buddy?" I muttered, my voice wavering slightly. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked ahead, staring into the blackness between the graves. I tried to pull him forward, but he refused to move. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what might be bothering him, but there was nothing, just the same old trees and crumbling tombstones. I took a slow step forward, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, when all of a sudden, rustling. Fast! Sharp! Right behind me. Before I could even think, I spun around, almost tripping over my own feet. And that's when I saw him. There was a man, not even 6 feet away, rushing straight toward me out of the dark, one arm raised. The first thing I noticed wasn't his face or his clothes. It was the knife in his hand, gleaming in the low light as he brought it down like he was about to stab. His face was twisted, eyes wide with something between rage and madness. Everything happened so fast it felt like time stuttered. Before I could react, Milo lunged. "Milo! No!" I screamed. But the dog didn't listen. He was already locked onto the man's arm, his jaws clamping down with a sickening snap. The man screamed, his voice echoing through the graveyard. I felt my stomach churn as I watched him struggle to get the dog off. Milo wasn't backing down. I didn't have time to think. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed Milo by the collar and yanked him back with all my strength, pulling him away from the man's thrashing, bleeding arm. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted. My legs moved on their own as I sprinted down the trail, Milo pulling against the leash, barking frantically as we raced away from the danger. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath and the pounding of my feet against the dirt path. I didn't stop until we reached the safety of Mrs. Dalton's house, slamming the door shut behind us. My hands were shaking as I locked the door and fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. I need help," I stammered. "There's a man. He attacked us. I don't know who he is. He had a knife. Please hurry." Minutes felt like hours while I waited inside the house. Milo was pacing, barking intermittently, as if he knew something was still out there. I kept staring at the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the man returning. Finally, the flashing lights of a squad car cut through the darkness. 2 officers arrived, one tall and broad, the other smaller, with a nervous energy about him. They asked me to explain everything. I did, breathlessly, recounting every detail of what had happened. The strange figure, the knife, and Milo's fierce protection. They didn't waste any time. The officers took statements and quickly headed toward the graveyard trail, flashlights cutting through the blackness. I stayed inside, wringing my hands, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself that Milo had saved me, that I was safe now. About 20 minutes later, the officers came back, dragging a bloodied man in cuffs. His face was pale, his clothes torn, and his eyes were wild. "He's the one who's been terrorizing local parks and trails," one of the officers said, his voice grim. "Assaults. He's been using the graveyard path as his escape route. It's a good thing you got out of there when you did." The officer's words hit me like a ton of bricks. This man had been targeting people for months, and he'd almost gotten me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind kept racing with the images of what had happened. I kept thinking about Milo, how he had saved my life. Without him, I don't think I would have made it back. It made me realize something. Sometimes the real danger isn't in the ghost stories people whisper about graveyards. It's the living. And for the first time, I understood why people avoid those dark trails at night. I still take walks, but never after dark. My name is Kaylee. I'm 22 years old and I'm an art student. You could probably say I'm the type of person who needs peace and quiet to think, especially when it comes to my art. Sometimes I just can't concentrate in a busy coffee shop or at home with all the noise. I need to be somewhere still, somewhere calm, so I can let my thoughts flow. And lately, that's been leading me to a strange place. I live in a small town in Texas. It's one of those places where you don't get much foot traffic, where most people have their routines and stick to them. But there's this old cemetery on the outskirts of town that has always intrigued me. I've passed it dozens of times, but there's something about it that never let me fully go near it. It always seemed off. That evening, I was restless. It was warm, sticky with humidity, but I needed to go somewhere. Somewhere quiet. The weather felt almost suffocating, but I needed a release. I grabbed my car keys and decided to head over to the cemetery. It wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes from my house, but I'd never gone there at night. There was just something about the idea of being alone in a place like that after dark that seemed a little too unsettling. But that night, I didn't care. I wanted to be alone, away from everything. The drive felt strange, though. The streets were empty, just the soft hum of my car's engine and the occasional flicker of a street light overhead. When I reached the cemetery, I parked my car near the side of the road, a little ways from the entrance. The cemetery looked different in the dark. The towering trees around it cast long shadows, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. The stone wall that lined the perimeter was crumbling in places, and the wrought iron gate stood half broken, barely hanging on its hinges. The graves, worn by age, seemed to lean at odd angles, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen. I grabbed my sketchbook from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, feeling the gravel shift under my shoes. The warm breeze brushed my face, and I felt a sense of calm, like a quiet invitation from the cemetery itself. I walked toward the broken gate. I chose a spot near a row of old gravestones. I set my things down, sitting cross-legged. I opened my sketchbook. I liked the feeling of being immersed in my art, the world around me fading as my pencil moved across the page. The strokes were easy at first, a flowing rhythm as I sketched the worn tombstones and crooked trees. For a while it was just me, the cemetery, and my drawing. It felt peaceful, almost therapeutic. But it didn't last long. It wasn't until sometime past midnight that I first noticed the car. I had been lost in my sketching, letting my hand drift across the paper. But something made me look up. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a car parked near the entrance of the cemetery. It wasn't there when I had arrived, and there were no headlights shining, so I couldn't make out much of the vehicle. But the moonlight illuminated the windshield just enough that I could tell there was someone sitting inside. I didn't immediately think much of it. Maybe someone else had come to visit the cemetery or was just driving through. It wasn't unusual for someone to park by the side of the road here, especially if they were looking for some peace and quiet. But then as I watched the car for a moment longer, I realized something odd. The figure inside wasn't moving. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It's just a person, I thought. They're probably just resting or waiting for someone. I turned back to my sketchbook, but my eyes kept drifting toward the car. The stillness of it nagged at me. It felt wrong. I glanced back at the figure. Still, no movement. The car was practically a shadow against the dark background of the cemetery, but it seemed to loom there, a silent presence. Minutes passed. I focused back on my sketch, but something felt off. I started to feel like I was being watched, like the figure in the car could somehow see me even though I couldn't see them clearly. My heart rate started to pick up, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake off the strange sense of dread crawling over me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it grew. My eyes drifted back to the car. The figure hadn't moved a muscle. That's when I felt it, that itch in my gut. Something was off. I stood, my legs stiff and unsteady beneath me. I didn't know why, but suddenly I had the overwhelming urge to leave. Quickly, I gathered my things, shoving my sketchbook into my bag. I walked out of the cemetery, heading toward my car. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires. The car was moving. The car had moved. It wasn't much at first, just a small roll forward. The headlights were still off, and the car didn't make a sound, but I could feel the air shift as it glided toward me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the car, my mind racing. Then, as if on cue, the car came to a complete stop right in front of me. A man stepped out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette dark against the light of the moon. He was wearing a cap, the brim pulled low over his face, hiding most of his features. I couldn't make out his eyes, but the way he stood with his body rigid and still set my nerves on edge. Something in the way he moved felt wrong. Without warning, he took a step toward me. I froze. His hand reached into his coat pocket, and I could see the faint glint of metal. It wasn't until he pulled it out that I realized what it was. A knife. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it would explode. He didn't say anything. He just walked toward me, the knife gleaming in his hand. In a split second, I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the gravel, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him chasing me, hear his footsteps gaining ground. Every step I took felt like a battle, my legs aching, but I pushed myself harder. I had to get away. I had to. I glanced up ahead and saw the dim outline of the road where I'd parked my car, just a short distance away. But I knew I couldn't make it there, not with him so close behind me. Just then, I saw a figure ahead. Another person. A jogger. I didn't even think. I shouted, "Help!" My voice cracked, but the jogger turned and saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he shouted at the man chasing me, "Get away from her!" The man hesitated. For a brief moment, he froze, but it was enough. That moment of doubt was enough for me to get a few more steps ahead. The man turned and fled, running back toward his car with a hasty, panicked pace. I could hear the screech of the tires as he sped off into the night, leaving the cemetery behind in silence. The jogger came up to me, keeping a cautious distance. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded, barely able to catch my breath. I was shaking, dizzy, but I kept thanking him, over and over again. He stayed with me, calling 911 while I leaned against the nearby fence, trying to steady myself. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only a few minutes. They took my statement, and I gave them the description of the car, the man, anything I could remember. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They had caught him. His name was Derek Foster. He had a long history of violent offenses, attacks, assaults, and other crimes. He had been linked to several unsolved cases in the area. The police said I was lucky. If it hadn't been for the jogger, I might not have made it out of there. I never went back to that cemetery. There's something about that place, something about that night that has never let go of me. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.